So I wanted to ask you a quite open-ended question on what prospect do you see for peace in Sudan today?
Well, I fear that I don't have a too optimistic answer here for the short-term future. Actually, no one is really speaking of peace now, but what is not only needed, but also possible, if there is enough political will, is at least to stop the fighting, to have ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, and give respite and relief to the people. Of course, once you have a ceasefire, it's much easier to bring humanitarian aid to the people. And once you have a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, peasants can go back to their fields and plant and harvest. Schools would open again, and pupils can and students can go to school, and people can go to work. So it is essential to have a ceasefire, which is not peace. It's just a silencing the guns. And here, Americans and the Saudis have partnered to lead ceasefire negotiations. It's very important. Now, at the same time, I don't think we have to wait for the success of ceasefire negotiations to do other things. Of course, the international community should continue to engage in humanitarian aid and even step up the humanitarian aid, because the needs are enormous. People are dying of hunger as we speak. A quarter of the population is threatened by severe food insecurity and actual hunger. So we cannot just agree on a ceasefire first before we move on the humanitarian front. No, we have to move on that, even though a ceasefire would make it easier. We also have to, basically the Sudanese have to continue, and we have to continue in supporting them, trying to get the civilian actors to agree on a common path forward. I don't think the Sudanese, after that experience with the militaries, first taking power and then getting into conflict over the spoils of their own coup and going to war against each other, the Sudanese want the military, after a ceasefire, also to determine the political path forward. So you need civilian voices, and that means politicians and leaders of political formations, but also civil society representatives and intellectuals and people from the business community and tribal leaders and religious leaders and everybody who represents civilian coming together and set out a common path for the future. And that can be assisted by international partners. It's now mainly the African Union taking the lead here with some support from the European Union and others. And then you have a fourth dimension, which is the neighboring states or the regional states who all have vested interests with regard to Sudan and are in one way or others involved. And now none of the interests, I think, are per se illegitimate. I mean, you have a legitimate interest in the stability of your neighboring regions. You don't want to be threatened by instability or by terrorism coming out of a neighboring country. But the way the regional communities are dealing with Sudan is not necessarily constructive. And I think what we need at the least is an open, honest conversation between the interested states in the region and also internationally about what they would refrain from doing. And the main thing would be they should all refrain from further fueling the war by delivering arms into a conflict scene.
If we try to dissect this, because there are different layers here, if we look first, then when we say that we think that the absence of fighting is the first step on the path forward, and that would be a ceasefire. I know it's a hard question, but what would you see would make the two main parties, to agree to a ceasefire?
Well, history is a bit of a guide here. So wars usually end either because one party wins and the other is defeated. And it doesn't really look like that in Sudan. Yes, the army seems to have more momentum right now than the RSF. The RSF had more momentum for the first year and a half, as it were. Now, army seems to have been resupplied, and they are on the march forward. But the gains they are making, it doesn't look as if they could easily reconquer everything they lost. And even if they were to win Khartoum, the capital, back and declare victory, it wouldn't necessarily be a victory across the entire country. So it doesn't simply look as if one party would win and one party would be defeated. So if the war doesn't end by that, other wars end by both parties, and sometimes it's more than two, being exhausted, running out of steam because the military formations are exhausted, civilian population are exhausted, and their resources are exhausted. So I think that is a more likely outcome, that at some point both parties realize that they cannot really make big advances anymore. If they win a few square kilometers, it doesn't really make a difference to the broader strategic picture. So they could as well save lives and resources and freeze the conflict at some not necessarily agreed but de facto lines of demarcations, which is not an ideal situation, not at all, but it's better than continued fighting, and it would allow civilians to go back to their jobs, and it would probably allow schools to be reopened and agriculture to go back, come back into work. It would allow humanitarian access. So the exhaustion option is probably the more realistic one at this stage.
It still paints a quite bleak picture that the best we can hope for is some kind of like tiredness or a low-intensive conflict or even a frozen conflict. But I mean, is there anything that we think, except kind of whoever fights the other one more, or as you say, they both realize that they can't really defeat each other? There is no other. I mean, I just want to prompt this. There is no other issue that can make these two.
Well, look, I'm terribly sorry. I'm not painting a brighter picture here, but I wouldn't be honest if I did. So we can only hope that I'm wrong. But for the time being, it looks as if both sides were still convinced that they can actually win, and I guess at some point they will realize that they cannot, or that they have to define winning in a different way, which doesn't mean winning and defeating the other side all across the country, but probably accept, at least for a time being, that the others are there. You cannot defeat them. They will not defeat you. So at least stop the fighting and try to rebuild the country, make the communities which you are responsible for more resilient against all that follows on a war. I mean, we have more diseases now in Sudan. We have cholera back. We have hunger. We spoke about that. So whoever is a warring party should have an interest. I mean, that's a moral demand. Should have an interest in ending the suffering of the people. And if you cannot win, you may be convinced that is probably what you do. Of course, we want to go beyond that, and of course, we want to have a real sustainable peace for the Sudan, and we want the Sudan to remain in one piece and not fragment or split. And for that, you need the civilians, the civilian population to make their voice heard.
Yeah. So let's.
I don't think that you would ever come back to a stable Sudan if you have different military formations ruling different parts of the country, or even if the two military formations would embrace and make up and divide power between themselves. I'm convinced you need a civilian authority which the military reports to in order to have a more stable situation and have peace in Sudan.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted just to turn, after having spoken about the parties, just a little bit, drill a little bit more into the people. You told us, and I think that's probably for those who work in our field of work should probably attend quite some of the focus now to work with the people. We spoke a bit in the beginning about the challenges of maybe compromising or the lack of reaching common understanding, which is not strange per se. But I was thinking, would you think about the ability for people to come together on different levels to agree on the bare minimum? Because I would presume that most civilians in Sudan want peace.
Well, I'm convinced that is the case, and in that consultation process which we led after the military coup, we did find out, as even some Sudanese commentators then wrote, that the Sudanese agree on more than they think they agree upon. There are vast areas of agreement, but given the political polarizations and divisions, they actually think that they disagree. But if you go deeper, you ask the constituencies of the political parties, for example, there's a lot of agreement. There is, I gave you one example about they all respect the military, they just don't want it to be in power. They agree on civilian rule, but they're not necessarily happy with the civilians that are in governing positions. But there is a lot of agreement. They want the periphery to participate in the politics of the country and not have this division between the center and the periphery forever. There's a vast amount of agreement, and peace is definitely one. They want peace, they want development, they want education, they want a functioning economy, of course, and that is what people want. And you have it didn't ask me for that, but if there's anything that gives me hope with regard to Sudan, it's the people. It's particularly the young people. 70% of the population are under 20. Yeah. So they have been active and have been on the streets, and they have been creative several times when they revolted against the Bashir regime, when they stood up against the military coup, and even today, when it is mostly young people, a lot of women among them, are giving practical help to people in need in their own countries, not necessarily organized in a formal NGO or other organization, but in these so-called emergency rooms, which is simply people deciding that they want to help their compatriots in distress. That is, bringing women who have suffered sexual violence out of the conflict zone and giving them support, organizing soup kitchens for the people who have no access to food or no money to pay for what the market prices are. These people are still there, and they need support, and actually these are the people that give me hope that the Sudan as a country has a future.
That's actually another very important issue that we don't often talk about when we talk about support to peace processes or negotiations or other issues. But something I myself have experienced is that as long as you have the social fabric is still there in a society, you can rebuild. what really scares me is that when a country has gone through such a dramatic development that the social fabric is evaporating, whatever, the way the codex of how people act against, like behave with each other, and the support one gives. And I have been talking with others about other contexts where they say that the saddest thing for them is that this social fabric has been broken. So it gives us a bit of hope to hear that, and maybe we need to think deeper on how we could engage, especially young people in Sudan, in a peaceful process.
Well, definitely. I mean, the situation now is, of course, that many of the young people have been recruited into the warring factions, into the Sudanese armed forces on one side, or into the RSF, or supporting militias that support either side now. And the more the war develops from a war between two organized military formations into a war that drags people in that weren't in the military when it started, either in the SAF or in the RSF, the more it risks to become a real civil war. And in parts of the country, it has actually evolved into a civil war with a lot of ethnic and tribal undertones, and that is difficult to contain and difficult to get right again.
Now, when we were discussing this, we do not have a UN support mission anymore in Sudan, and but we do have the African Union. We have partners. We have, of course, a UN family with funds, agencies, and program. But in your view, is there a moment now for another UN presence in or to?
Well, let me be clear here. The UN never walked away from Sudan, both as a political mission and the agency's funds and programs. That's UNICEF and WHO and WFP and UNHCR and all the others. We all stayed there when the war started. We evacuated our families. We evacuated our non-essential staff, but we were all still there with a limited core presence, but prepared to spread out again and to support the Sudan wherever that was possible. Now, UNITAM, the political mission, was expelled and was eventually terminated, but the agencies are still there. It's extremely difficult for them. Access to areas under control of different parties is difficult. Delivering aid to those who need it in the conflict zone is extremely difficult, but the agencies are there and prepared to do that. And yes, we don't have a political mission on the ground, but we do have on the political side a personal envoy of the Secretary General, which is former Algerian Foreign Minister Lamamra, also a former AU commissioner, so someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool African diplomat, knows all the actors in the region very well, is a respected and experienced diplomat. And his main task, which he got from the Secretary General, but which has also been accepted by the international community, is that he addresses the different state actors and regional organizations and international organizations who come with initiatives in order to find a solution for Sudan. So his task is to coordinate that, or to find out what the challenges are and try to work on that. And I would say he needs to be supported. He needs to have the support of member states from the United Nations. So here, European member states or the European Union or others could come in and should come in and support him.
Thank you for clarifying that. It's important. And maybe just so we understand what we're thinking when we say the Europeans should support him? Do we think in terms of political support, financial support, or what kind of support?
Well, A, I would say let him define what kind of support he needs. B, there are certain things which states can do, but a personal envoy of the Secretary General can not do. States have, or the European Union for that matter, have a different form of convening power, for example. If you want to get foreign ministers or heads of government together from relevant players, that's something which the United Nations can hardly do. So they would need the support of mighty actors, as it were, and that could be the European Union. We're going to have a new European Commission, a new High Representative as President for international policy. So and member states could do that.
A bit of a political backing or a host.
Well, whatever, that has to be defined. It's not about the European Union or any member state inside or outside Europe to assume a role and so we are doing that. No. It's about coordinating with the UN, with the Special Envoy or with Secretary General about how states could help to put more resources, and that means time and political energy and political capital, as it were, also material resources, but that's not always the number one priority, to put that behind the effort of the personal envoy of CSG.
Yeah. I wanted, before we close, maybe touch a little bit on, in the global world today, there are competing conflicts, and oftentimes it feels like Sudan, despite those horrendous sufferings that you have touched upon, including more than, I would think now, 11. I mean, displaced people and all the suffering of not enough of food, no health care, no schooling for children because of the conflict. I wanted to hear. We don't hear much about it here in Sweden. What do you think? What's the reason that it's kind of almost a forgotten conflict in the public eye?
Well, I would say it's not a forgotten conflict. It's a politically ignored conflict, because we, meaning European countries, but also the US and many other countries in the world, there are other conflicts which we pay more attention to, or which sort of consume our attention and political energy much more. And of course, for Europeans, that's a war in Ukraine in the first place, and that's a war between Israel and Hamas, a war in Gaza, a war in Lebanon, which draws a lot of attention. Also, particularly the Gaza war, a lot of attention of other countries in the global south who look to that war much more than to a war in the middle of Africa. And we tend to ignore then that actually in sheer numbers, as you said, 11 million people displaced, Sudan has created the currently largest humanitarian catastrophe worldwide. But I don't think we should get into a contest between different conflicts, which one is the worst. They're all bad and they all demand our attention, but I don't want to speak about the capacities of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, but I know from many foreign ministries that they cannot really handle more than 2 international crises at a time. That seems to go even for the State Department in Washington, or for the German Foreign Ministry, or for many others. So you concentrate your attention, and then public opinion is very important. Does public opinion demand from policymakers to concentrate on a conflict in Africa? There are other conflicts in Africa, by the way, that also are forgotten. I mean, how much do we read about what's happening in Eastern Congo, or in Asian context, how much do we read about the conflict in Myanmar? We are very much concentrated on a few, and we probably don't have the capacity. And then there is a final factor, I guess, which may sound cynical to speak about that, but the displaced people and the refugees are not coming to our doorsteps yet from Sudan. It's mainly poorer countries that are absorbing the displaced. The majority of the displaced people are still in Sudan, so it's other Sudanese communities taking care of their neighbors from their own countries, and then it's poorer countries in the neighborhood. It's Egypt, it's Chad, it's South Sudan, where people are fleeing to. They are not yet at the shores of the Mediterranean, not yet at the shores of Europe. If we had the displaced persons close to Europe, we would pay more attention.
Let's hope that we will get some political recognition of the conflict before we end up, in an even worse situation. I wanted to end this a bit on your reflection on your journey, and a bit maybe even on a personal level. It was kind of you went in with one mandate and one mission, and you left with another situation. So maybe if you wanted to make a final kind of reflection personally on the journey with UNITAMS before we close.
Well, look, it's actually not about my personal feelings. I mean, I said so much. Of course, it is with a lot of sadness I look at Sudan. I'm still in contact, of course, with many Sudanese, and we mainly see them, since we cannot go to Sudan anymore. We mainly see them when they come through where I live, or when we meet them at other international places. I still think that if you personalize it, or if we want to have it less personal, the UN would have to do the same thing again, namely try to assist a political transition if there is a demand from within the country, which was there officially by the government, that it would have, again, to try to de-escalate if it sees tensions brewing, and it would have, again, to facilitate, in cooperation with our regional partners here, AU and Africa, and IGAD or other African partners, that we would again have to facilitate negotiations, conversations between local actors in order to come to a yes, which in the Sudanese case would have meant back to civilian governments, back to constitutional rule.
Then I hope that we will have an end of the fighting, a situation that calms down, whatever the reason between the parties to agree to it, and that maybe there will be the time for another attempt for UN or another international partner to support the Sudanese with a transition to a democratic society. I thank you so much, Dr. Volker Peters, former SRSG for the UN mission and the latest UN mission to Sudan, UNITAMS, for coming and talking to us.
Thank you very much, Pernilla. It was a pleasure.